one waitress, one arrogant millionaire, and a grand piano. What started as a cruel attempt to humiliate her turned into a moment that silenced the room and shattered egos. You won't believe how she turned the tables with nothing but her talent. It was a warm Friday evening, and the hum of conversations filled the air at La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant tucked into the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. The clinking of glasses, the soft footsteps of servers, and the faint strains of jazz from a corner piano created an ambiance of refined indulgence. Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress with a quiet demeanor and an unmistakable spark in her eyes, moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates and smiles. To most patrons, she was just another face in a uniform. But inside, she carried dreams bigger than the luxurious dining room around her. Deborah's passion wasn't serving tables, it was music. Ever since she was a child, the piano had been her refuge, a place where she could express every joy, every sorrow, and every unspoken thought. But dreams don't pay the bills. Working long shifts at La Fontaine was a necessity, a stepping stone toward the music academy she longed to attend. Few knew about her talent, except for the restaurant staff, who occasionally caught her stealing moments at the old upright piano in the back room during her breaks. That night, as the evening rush began to settle, the door swung open, and in walked Leonard Grayson, instantly recognizable. The wealthy entrepreneur made an entrance like he owned the room, flanked by a few equally polished companions. Leonard exuded an air of superiority, known for his sharp tongue and penchant for spectacle. His presence made even the most seasoned staff stand straighter. Deborah's colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Leonard was not an easy guest. He was the kind of man who thrived on pushing people's buttons. But for Deborah, he was just another table to manage in a long night's work. Little did she know this wasn't going to be a normal evening. As Leonard scanned the room, his gaze landed on Deborah. Something about her seemed to catch his attention. A momentary pause, then a smirk. Deborah felt the weight of his stare but brushed it off, focusing instead on refilling water glasses and clearing plates. But Leonard wasn't done with her. He had already decided she was going to be his entertainment for the night. Deborah had grown up in a small town in South Carolina, where dreams of grandeur often felt as distant as the stars. Her mother, a single parent and a tireless caregiver, worked double shifts as a nurse to ensure Deborah and her siblings had food on the table. Despite their modest means, music had always been a constant in their home. Her mother's old vinyl records and the out-of-tune piano gifted by a neighbor were the seeds of Deborah's love for melody. That piano became her escape. While other kids played outside, Deborah spent hours teaching herself to play. She mimicked the songs on the radio, then ventured into classical pieces she found in second-hand music books. Her talent didn't go unnoticed. She played at church, school recitals, and community events. But recognition couldn't mask the financial hurdles that loomed over her dreams. By the time she turned 18, the reality was clear. A professional music career would have to wait. Scholarships didn't come through, and family responsibilities took precedence. Deborah packed away her concert ambitions, replacing them with the practicality of earning a living. Yet she couldn't entirely give up the piano. It was more than a dream. It was her identity. When she moved to Raleigh a few years ago, Deborah sought out a job at La Fontaine, not just because of the pay, but because of the grand piano tucked into the corner of the restaurant. Even though she rarely had time to play it, just knowing it was there gave her a sense of comfort. Music hadn't left her, it was simply waiting. That night, as Leonard and his entourage took their seats, Deborah approached their table, balancing a tray with practiced grace. Leonard ordered a top-shelf scotch and cracked a joke loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Deborah offered a polite smile as she took their orders, her voice steady despite the strange energy radiating from him. "Deborah, huh?" Leonard said, glancing at her name tag. "Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." The comment caught her off guard, but she nodded politely and stepped away to place their orders. She didn't notice the knowing grin he shared with his companions, nor the way his eyes followed her every move. Leonard wasn't just observing, he was planning. And Deborah would soon find herself at the center of a spectacle she never asked for. The night carried on like any other, with the hum of laughter and silverware filling the room. Deborah kept her pace steady, avoiding Leonard's gaze as she moved between tables. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about him felt different. Not just rude, but calculated. His presence loomed like a shadow, making her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite shake. By the time the appetizers were served, Leonard had already started his performance, though not the kind Deborah expected. He held court at his table, loudly recounting tales of his success and peppering in jabs about people who lacked ambition. His entourage laughed dutifully, while other diners shot annoyed glances in his direction. Deborah tried to stay focused on her tasks, but as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Leonard caught her off guard. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." His words stopped her. Deborah hesitated, then gave a careful answer. "I play piano, sometimes," she said softly, hoping to keep it brief. Leonard's eyes lit up, and a sly smile curled across his lips. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" Deborah froze. The room seemed quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard wasn't about to let it go. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice booming. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His companions chuckled, clearly enjoying the show. Other diners turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Deborah's chest tightened. She could feel the heat of their stares, the silent judgment waiting to unfold. She wanted to say no, to walk away. But Leonard's challenge hung in the air, daring her to rise to it or crumble under its weight. "I really shouldn't," Deborah stammered, glancing around for support. But even her colleagues seemed hesitant to intervene. Leonard leaned back in his chair, sipping his scotch with a smirk. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words hit like a slap. Deborah's hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't one to seek confrontation, but the way he dismissed her, like she was a joke, a nobody, cut deeper than she expected. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never let anyone make you small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." A moment of silence stretched between them. Deborah glanced at the piano, then back at Leonard. His smug expression dared her to take the bait, and against her better judgment she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but low. "I'll play." The room bristled with anticipation as Deborah walked toward the piano, each step carrying the weight of both fear and defiance. The dining room seemed to hold its breath as she approached the gleaming grand piano. The soft glow of the chandelier above cast a spotlight on her, isolating her from the murmuring crowd. Her fingers trembled as she slid onto the bench. The polished keys gleamed like a challenge waiting to be met. Behind her, Leonard leaned back in his chair, the picture of smug satisfaction, as though he had already won whatever game he was playing. Deborah closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. This wasn't the church recital or the cozy community gatherings she'd once known. This was different. This was hostile. But there was no turning back now. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool surface beneath her fingertips. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost fragile. A few diners shifted in their seats, and someone coughed in the back of the room. Deborah ignored them, her focus sharpening as she leaned into the music. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody spilled into the room, weaving through the air like a thread, delicate but unyielding. As her confidence grew, the music swelled. Her hands moved with a grace that belied the chaos inside her. The notes poured out like a confession. Each chord seemed to carry a piece of her story. The sacrifices her mother made, the nights she spent practicing in a cramped room, the weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned. The diners fell silent. Their earlier chatter was replaced by a collective stillness. Even Leonard, who had been whispering to his companions, went quiet. Deborah didn't need to look at him to feel the shift in the room. The mocking energy had dissipated, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps awe, perhaps humility. The music soared, and Deborah let herself go. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't a waitress or a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. By the time she struck the final chord, the room was utterly still. For a moment there was no sound, just the lingering resonance of the piano. Deborah sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys, unsure of what would come next. Then, as though released from a spell, the audience erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, reverberating off the walls and filling the room with a warmth Deborah hadn't expected. Some diners stood, clapping with a fervor that brought tears to her eyes. Her co-workers, who had been watching,